April 16th, 1945. Two convoys are racing through the Austrian countryside toward the same destination, a salt mine near the village of Altaussee. In the first convoy, American Monuments men are following intelligence reports about a massive Nazi art cache. In the second convoy, Soviet trophy brigade specialists are heading to the same location with orders to secure whatever they find for immediate transport to Moscow. What happened when these two philosophies of cultural preservation met face-to-face would determine the fate of thousands of European masterpieces and create diplomatic tensions that persist to this day. Welcome back to our investigation into the secret war for European art. I'm Jeff Goldman, and if you've been following the series, you know we've uncovered how American Monuments men and Stalin's trophy brigades were conducting parallel operations across war-torn Europe. Today, I'm going to reveal what happened when these operations collided, creating some of the most dramatic moments in cultural history. The race to Altaussee perfectly illustrates the fundamental difference between these two approaches. The American team was led by Captain Robert Posey, an architect from Alabama, and Private Lincoln Kirstein, who would later found the New York City Ballet. They had received reports from German informants about a massive storage facility hidden in the salt mine, but they had no idea what they would actually find. The Soviet team was led by Major Dmitry Shepilov, an art historian from Leningrad who had been tracking the same intelligence through captured German documents. Unlike the Americans, Shepilov had detailed inventories of what was supposed to be in the mine, compiled from German museum records that had been seized in Berlin. Here's what makes this moment so incredible. Both teams arrived at Altaussee within 6 hours of each other. The Americans got there first, but just barely. When Posey and Kirstein entered the mine on the morning of April 16th, they discovered something that defied imagination, chamber after chamber filled with the greatest art collection ever assembled in one location. Posey's initial report to headquarters reads like something from a treasure hunter's dream. Have discovered extensive underground storage facility containing approximately 6,700 paintings, including works verified as Michelangelo, Vermeer, Durer, and Van Eyck. Additionally found 230 sculptures, 1,200 pieces of decorative arts, and extensive documentation suggesting this represents only a portion of total Nazi acquisitions. Recommend immediate security deployment and expert authentication team. But here's the detail that changes everything. At the bottom of that same report, Posey added a single line that would create an international incident. Soviet personnel arrived this afternoon with transportation equipment and acquisition orders. Diplomatic guidance urgently requested. Picture this scene. American and Soviet specialists, former allies in the war against fascism, now facing each other across chambers filled with some of Europe's greatest artistic treasures. The Americans arguing for preservation and restitution, the Soviets presenting official orders for war reparations. Both sides legally authorized by their governments, both sides convinced they were doing the right thing. Lincoln Kirstein later wrote about that confrontation, "It was surreal. Here we were, surrounded by Rembrandts and Picassos, having what amounted to a diplomatic crisis underground." Major Shepilov was completely professional, but he made it clear that Soviet forces intended to secure these materials under war reparations agreements. We had no legal authority to stop them, but we also couldn't allow the wholesale transfer of European cultural heritage to Moscow. The standoff at Altaussee lasted for 3 days. Both sides sent urgent communications to their respective governments. The Americans argued that these artworks belonged to their original owners and should be repatriated through proper legal channels. The Soviets maintained that German cultural property was legitimate war booty under agreements signed at Yalta. What broke the deadlock was a discovery that neither side anticipated. Deep in the mine, American and Soviet specialists working together found something that changed the entire dynamic. Detailed Nazi documentation proving that most of the art in Altaussee hadn't belonged to German state museums. It had been stolen from Jewish families, private collectors, and museums across occupied Europe. Dr. Hermann Bunges, a captured German art historian who had supervised the Altaussee operation, provided documentation that revealed the true scope of Nazi cultural crimes. Lists of original owners, forged provenance documents, and shipping records that showed how systematically the Nazis had looted private collections throughout Europe. This discovery created an unexpected alliance between the American and Soviet teams. Both sides realized they weren't just dealing with German state property, but with cultural materials that belonged to victims of Nazi persecution. The question was no longer whether these items should be considered war reparations, but how to identify and locate the rightful owners. Major Shepilov, the Soviet team leader, made a decision that probably saved thousands of artworks from disappearing into Soviet storage facilities. He agreed to a joint documentation project where American and Soviet specialists would work together to identify ownership and provenance for every item in the mine. For 2 weeks in April 1945, you had this incredible scene: American art historians and Soviet cultural experts working side by side in an Austrian salt mine, photographing, cataloging, and researching the ownership of masterpieces that hadn't been seen in public for years. It was probably the most successful example of cultural cooperation between the superpowers during the entire war. But this cooperation was an exception, not the rule. At dozens of other locations across Germany and Austria, American and Soviet cultural teams were having very different encounters. The diplomatic niceties that worked at Altaussee didn't apply when the stakes were lower and the documentation was less clear. Captain James Rohrimer encountered a more typical situation at Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria. His team had located Hermann Göring's private art collection, including paintings worth millions even by 1945 standards. When Soviet specialists arrived 2 days later, they presented orders from Moscow authorizing immediate transfer of all German state property. Rohrimer's confrontation with Colonel Yevgeny Koldyaï, the Soviet team leader, was much more hostile than what had happened at Altaussee. Koldyaï argued that Göring's collection, as property of a high-ranking Nazi official, was clearly subject to war reparations. Rohrimer maintained that many pieces in the collection had been stolen from French and Dutch museums and needed to be returned to their original institutions. The argument escalated when Koldyaï ordered his men to begin loading trucks with Göring's paintings. Rohrimer responded by posting American guards at the castle entrance. For 6 hours, you had American and Soviet soldiers facing each other in what could have become an armed confrontation over a collection of French Impressionist paintings. The crisis was resolved only when General Dwight Eisenhower personally intervened, establishing what became known as the Cultural Demarcation Protocol. Under this agreement, American and Soviet forces would share information about art discoveries, but each side would secure materials found in their respective occupation zones pending final diplomatic resolution. This protocol sounds reasonable, but in practice it meant that the systematic approach of Stalin's trophy brigades gave them enormous advantages. While Americans were focused on individual dramatic discoveries, Soviet teams were methodically working through comprehensive target lists in their occupation zone. The results were predictable. Between April and December 1945, American monuments men secured and documented approximately 60,000 artworks for eventual restitution. During the same period, Soviet trophy brigades shipped an estimated 800,000 items eastward under war reparations authority. But the Americans were beginning to understand the scale of what they were up against. In June 1945, Monuments Officer Roosevelt made a discovery that revealed the true scope of Soviet cultural acquisitions. Beland had been tracking Nazi art shipments from France, and she noticed something disturbing in captured German transportation records. Beland found shipping manifests showing that Soviet forces had acquired not just art that was hidden in their occupation zone, but also items that had been stored in areas that were supposed to be under American or British control. Trophy brigades were conducting operations in Western Germany using transportation routes that suggested coordination with some American units. Her investigation revealed that several American officers were facilitating Soviet art acquisitions in exchange for intelligence about Nazi gold reserves. The cultural preservation mission was being compromised by individuals who saw trophy brigade operations as opportunities for personal profit. This discovery led to one of the most significant confrontations between American and Soviet cultural teams. In August 1945, Captain Walter Farmer led a team to investigate reports that an entire trainload of French paintings was being held at a railroad depot in the Soviet zone, despite evidence that these works belonged to French museums. When Farmer's team arrived at the depot, they found not just the French paintings, but also items that had been documented by American monuments men in facilities supposed to be under Western control. Colonel Victor Baldin, the Soviet officer supervising the depot, initially denied that any irregular transfers had occurred. The confrontation escalated when Farmer presented shipping documents proving that American transportation assets had been used to move artworks from the Western zones to Soviet collection points. Baldin finally admitted that there had been informal cooperation between certain American officers and trophy brigade operations. This revelation created a scandal that reached the highest levels of Allied command. General George Patton ordered immediate investigations into American personnel who had facilitated Soviet art acquisitions. The investigation revealed that at least 12 American officers had accepted payments or gold reserves in exchange for providing trophy brigades with access to art caches in the Western zones. The scandal effectively ended direct cooperation between American and Soviet cultural teams. From September 1945 onward, both sides operated independently, often in direct competition for the same cultural targets. This competition intensified as both sides realized that the Cold War was beginning and cultural resources would become tools of diplomatic leverage. American officials began to understand that Stalin's trophy brigades weren't just collecting art for museums, but assembling cultural assets that could be used in post-war negotiations. The most dramatic example of this new competition came in October 1945, when both American and Soviet teams raced to reach Kronach Castle, where intelligence indicated the Nazis had hidden the complete archive of the German Archaeological Institute. This archive contained documentation of archaeological sites and discoveries across the Mediterranean, information that would be invaluable for post-war cultural diplomacy. The race to Kronach became a symbol of how the alliance against fascism was transforming into superpower competition. Both sides understood that controlling cultural information meant controlling the narrative of European civilization itself. In our final episode, I'm going to reveal what happened to all those millions of artworks that disappeared into the Soviet Union, why most of them remain there today, and how families around the world are still fighting legal battles to recover their stolen heritage. We'll also explore the modern consequences of this cultural Cold War and why it continues to influence international relations today. Because the truth is, the secret war for European art never really ended. It just moved from salt mines and castle vaults to courtrooms and diplomatic negotiations, where it continues to this day.